Hello, everyone. This is recording number 12 for a class on early Greek philosophy. I want to turn to Protagoras, who is perhaps the most famous sophist. Now, in the past, the sophists were not necessarily treated as philosophers. Indeed, there was often the thought that sophists, as it were, merely want to persuade, or they merely want to win the argument. They do not want to find the truth. And hence, there was the assumption that there is even a kind of contrast between being a philosopher versus being a sophist. At the same time, both Plato and Aristotle take Protagoras quite seriously. They respond to him again and again throughout their work, and they respond philosophically to him. So they do not agree with him, but they engage philosophically with what they take to be his views. And I think we could, follow that lead. And that means that we treat Protagoras as a philosopher. Now, the most famous fragment that survives from Protagoras' writings is transmitted in Plato's dialogue Theaetetus and also in a work by Sextus Empiricus. And it says the following: Man, or the human being, is the measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. Now, what should we make of this? I want to talk through, as it were, a spectrum of options that we have here. It is quite tempting to just say, well, this is quite enigmatic, and let me look at what Plato says in the Theaetetus. Plato offers a kind of extensive analysis and reconstruction of what this so-called measure doctrine, also called Protagorean relativism, amounts to. At the same time, it is clear that Plato does not offer, as it were, a historical record. Rather, Plato seems to ask, what is it that someone must hold if they hold this measure doctrine, that human beings are the measure of all things? So, what should we do? One option is that we say, let's just not think at all about what Plato says or what Aristotle says. Let's just think about this pronouncement. And, how would we do that? We could ask, what is the relevant notion of measure? We could ask, what are the relevant notions of being and not being? And those are good questions to ask. We could maybe pursue them by looking at other sophists, other writers at the time. How do they use these notions? So that is an option. But given the brevity of the fragment, we don't have a lot to work with. So it is quite tempting that we turn to Plato at least a little bit. And that would be, maybe an interim approach that we say, well, we don't really think that what Plato says in the Theaetetus is necessarily Protagoras' view. But maybe kind of along the way, as Plato lays out what he takes to be the implications of this measure doctrine, maybe some of this is Protagoras' view. And in particular, two kind of moments in that analysis seem to be candidates. It maybe is plausible to assume that Protagoras holds that what seems to a person is true for her. That is, as it were, a stage in Plato's analysis, and maybe that is what Plato indeed thinks Protagoras held, and maybe there is plausibility to this. The next stage would be to say, well, what Protagoras held was what seems to a person is true, period, as it were, without the qualifier true for her. And there are, difficult questions about what is the difference between what seems to a person is true for her and what seems to a person is true. But those would be options, interpretive options, that, as it were, accept some of what Plato says, but not all of it. The most extreme option, in a way, would be to say, well, maybe Plato's approach is quite right to ask, what is someone committed to if they hold the measure doctrine? And Plato's answer to this is, well, this person would be committed to a quite comprehensive philosophical outlook, which includes a metaphysics and a theory of perception. And indeed, Plato argues that what this includes is quite similar to the kinds of positions that we studied in the last couple of weeks. Namely, he argues that for it to be the case that the human being is the measure of all things, a metaphysics of flux, a kind of Heraclitean metaphysics, must hold, and we need something like an atomist theory of sense perception. So I want to leave it here and just invite you to think more about the measure doctrine.